Hey, welcome to Big Sexy Radio. I'm Crystal.
Hi, I'm Murph.
Hi, Murph. And we are Big Sexy Chat. And I'm so excited to say that we have two amazing guests on tonight from the NAAFA group organization called the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. We have the chair, Tigress, and we have the advocacy coordinator. Is that right, Tegan?
Advocacy chair, yeah.
Advocacy chair, Tegan, on the show with us tonight. We're going to talk all about making fat people a protected class. Is that the right way to say it, Tigress?
That's a great way to say it. There are lots of
Okay.
different ways to do this, but that's the ultimate goal.
Wonderful. So, lots of exciting things going on. And I know y'all are in New York and doing all kinds of cool things, and stuff is happening, right? Yay, hooray. It's, of course, breadcrumbs. Fat people are used to, we're used to just getting breadcrumbs. But anyway, some really good stuff going on. We want to hear all about it. And Tigress, would you mind telling us a little bit about the origin of NAAFA.org?
Happy to. So, as Crystal said, NAAFA is the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. We are the world's oldest documented fat rights group. And we always make a point these days of emphasizing that documented part because people will sometimes say things like the size acceptance movement started with the founding of NAAFA. And in a way, that's true because the sort of organized and formal movement came into shape there, but we know that there were fat ass, badass people living their best lives as individuals. And we also know that there was tremendous fat leadership in other social justice spaces, particularly the Black American civil rights movement and the US queer rights movement. And I'm sure queer rights and civil rights movements in other places where, where fat people were really in leadership roles, particularly Black women and femmes in the US civil rights movement. And those folks were inspirations to, to the early people in fat liberation or size acceptance or whatever it was being called at various stages of this multi-decade movement. But NAAFA was started by Bill Fabry, who was a young engineer living in upstate New York and just like head over heels in love with his wife Joyce, who was a fat woman. And Bill was seeing the way that Joyce was treated in the world, and the effects that had on Joyce, in terms of her psychology and her well-being. And so he was seeing things like workplace discrimination, and he was experiencing things like being a husband who wanted to buy a blouse for his wife for her birthday and not being able to find one anywhere in his town. And he began to sort of think about the ways that he could do something bigger than just be nice to his wife and be supportive of his wife. So in the couple of years before NAAFA was founded in 1969, there were two noteworthy things that happened. One was the Fat In New York City, which was like a radio station DJ got together about 500 people in Central Park to just declare that, they were going to kick diets to the curb and live in their bodies as their bodies existed. And then in the following year, a writer named Lou Lauterbach and his wife Anne, wrote an article in the Saturday Evening Post that was all about how people should like get off the hamster wheel of dieting and accept that if we all settled into our natural body sizes, there would be more fat people. The article was actually called "More People Should Be Fat," and it wasn't like, "Hey, y'all, get on the fat, roller coaster with us." It was more like, it's just if we just acted like this was a natural thing and everybody wasn't dieting themselves into an unnatural body shape, then there would be more fat people. So those two things happened, and then and Bill was kind of watching those things and wrote a letter to Lou Lauterbach and said like, "Hey, would you like to work with me on starting an organization?" And Bill and Lou and some other folks that they gathered by mimeographing Lou's article and handing it out about town, and a lawyer that they worked with to help them sort of draw up articles of incorporation and all that kind of technical stuff. This like small crew of folks got together in New York and founded NAAFA in June of 1969, had their first meeting.
I think that they just wanted to create a group or a club where we could all just glorify obesity.
That's exactly.
Yay!
I tell folks all the time when I, present on fat liberation history that, there are lots of reasons why we don't use the O words, overweight and obesity. But the two places that I love to use them are in middle fingers up to that phrase, glorifying obesity. And then also, I've been thinking about this a lot the last couple of weeks. I just really love Heavy D, and he had this whole persona as the overweight lover. So I accept the term overweight in that usage only.
I love it. And just for our listeners, this isn't just about, I want to buy clothes that make me, feel great, or I want to be able to shop in a store. There's more to the fat liberation movement. And this is the stuff that y'all are doing, that y'all are working on, which is the meaty stuff, like, protecting people from being able to be discriminated against at work. Or have any of you guys have you ever peed sideways on a toilet in a restaurant? I have. And it
I have not,
sucks.
I know why you're asking.
Yeah.
Big accommodation, all of the spaces that
Mhm.
we use in all of the ways.
Thank you.
And be really inaccessible for people in larger bodies.
Yeah. My favorite karaoke restaurant. You have to, if you go into the stall that's for people with disabilities, you have to pee sideways on the toilet seat. So that's fun.
I think Crystal knows this. Murph, I don't know if you know this, but I used to be a nightclub promoter before I was the chair of NAAFA, and I ran a plus size hip hop party in Oakland. And one of the most difficult things about finding a venue that was, size inclusive was finding a space where the bathrooms were big enough for people with larger hips, or with bigger bodies. And it was really a significant limitation in terms of the venues that were available to us.
Yeah.
Can I just say something before? I'd like Tegan to talk a little bit more about the other ways that size discrimination shows up in the world, in the, like what Crystal said, the meaty ways. But can I just add one more thought though, before I pass it off to Tegan? I do think that the fashion issue, I get asked this question a lot, or we hear like lots of sentiment sometimes in fat community or from people outside of fat community, like, why do they talk about fashion so much? There are more significant things to, be worried about. And I always like to remind folks that, first of all, fat people need and deserve the right to express ourselves with all of the, available means of expression that everyone else is entitled to. And fashion is one of those. But also, all of the other ways that Tegan's going to tell you about are things that people need appropriate clothing to manage. So if you have to, as we talk about, other ways or things that the laws that we're working on supporting will protect and protect against, just think about what it means to be somebody who doesn't have access to appropriate clothing. And then think about what fashion looks like as an industry, and where opportunity, economic opportunity, job stability, like all of those things can also come into play in terms of fashion. Cause like we can get really like, oh, well, you can't get a pink dress. That's so hard, right? But it's also like, yes, first of all, I can't get a pink dress. And that is hard. If I want a pink dress, I should be able to get one just like everyone else can. And anybody who can't get one because it's not made for their body, that's a problem. But also there are more layers to it even within the fashion piece.
Right. It's just like I'm letting all this stuff sink in because like every time it's just I'm processing all this. It's wonderful. I love hearing this.
Yeah, talking to Tigress is really just like, I don't know, like going to church kind of. Like you're just like, oh, say more. Like I feel like I'm learning so much. But as Tigress mentioned, there are other things that these bills cover, and I can talk a little bit about those too. So employment discrimination is a pretty big part of it. As we've been like digging through the data and just trying to really back up all of our arguments with research, we found a lot of really, I think, shocking statistics that people would be surprised by, whether they are in favor of or against this legislation. So, for example, like one of the articles or one of the statistics was that women, this article only looked at like cis men and cis women, but was that women make, it was for every 25 pounds that a woman gains, her annual salary decreases by $15,000, which is quite a large amount of money, right? And so, and 25 pounds, I mean, it's not like that can be gained pretty quickly, pretty easily, pretty whatever, and so not that there's a certain amount where it's like, oh, that's fine, but I don't know, I think that just really it's so much more, like Tigress was saying, so much more about, oh, I can't get a job, or I'm, whatever. And like, am I compensated fairly at my job? Am I doing a job that I feel respected in? Are my coworkers making comments about me at my job, or disrespecting me, or, saying whatever at my job? One person that we spoke to was talking about how she worked in a store, like in retail, and became pregnant. And initially she worked out on the floor of the store and was like, interacting with customers, very visible, whatever, became pregnant, gained weight, and then was moved to the back, like stocking shelves and whatever, right? Which is pretty, I mean, for a pregnant person to be like stocking shelves also is like maybe an issue, but also just the fact that like she was moved out of this visible role once she gained weight, right? And so employment is a huge one. It also covers housing and public accommodations. So that can be anything from like public transportation to, in public schools, are there desks that fit like all of the different types of students, right? Are they those desks that like have the little arm that comes out and sits in front of you that like only 6 people in the whole world can fit into?
Curse those desks.
Yeah. Public accommodations can be, there's a lot of things that can be, but school, or like public schools are a huge one. Public transportation, anything that is really like the commons, I guess, where the public gathers, or the public has access to, is covered by the public accommodations. I guess it would be considered that.
One thing, Tegan, I was going to bring up when you were talking a moment ago is, if you work somewhere where you have to wear a uniform. I've had this problem myself, and I know everybody's had this problem that's fat. It's like, we only go up to 2X. Well, I need a 5X. Sorry, make the 2X work. Well, how? I mean, that's the kind of bullshit that pisses me off. And it's kind of fashion related too, like as we were talking about a second ago. And I saw Tigress had her hand up as well. But I want to make sure we mention that, because it's not fair if you can't accommodate a work shirt that I have to wear to work, and maybe even have to pay for. I want one that's in my size.
Right. And that's not asking a ton to be like, can I wear a shirt that is in my size? Can I not be forced into a shirt that's 3 sizes too small for me? Like, you're hardly asking for the world at that point.
Well, and this is one of the reasons why, legislative change can make a huge difference, right? Because you can be in a workplace where your boss is 100% sympathetic to that. And maybe even the regional manager is sympathetic to that. And then they can't get that uniform for you because they're not available easily. Or, it's hard to get the company to make a move on that. And so having some regulations around what companies are expected to do to be accessible workplaces is just like super, super important. But I feel like maybe we've got something that we need to ask your listeners is whether they are already aware of just how few of these laws exist, because sometimes people are quite surprised. So if you're listening to the podcast right now, I'm going to ask you to just think about where in this country you think there are already laws that explicitly tell people that they cannot discriminate based on height and weight. And I know we talked about this a little off camera before we started the podcast, but before I told you where they were, Crystal and Murph, where did you think they were?
I thought the only place was San Francisco and Michigan.
I knew it was Santa Cruz and San Francisco for sure, and I knew it was the whole state of Michigan, but that's all I knew. I didn't know if there was anywhere. I just figured California is progressive, so that makes sense why San Francisco and Santa Cruz would have it. But I don't know. I'm cynical though, so I don't think it's not going to be anywhere.
Really surprised.
Tegan, before you started doing this, where would you have guessed?
I think New York City would definitely be one that I would have guessed, just because, yeah, it's seen as like the hub of progress, right? California too. I think maybe not the entire state, but I think I would definitely think like the Bay Area for sure. Um, but other than that, yeah, I definitely wouldn't have thought. I mean, I know the places now, but I definitely wouldn't have thought like any of the places or the majority of the places that aren't the Bay Area and New York City.
Yeah. So then I find that, people generally have a sense that you can kind of sue anyone for anything, and you can. The fact that laws don't exist does not mean that you cannot take a case to court. It means that when you take a case to court, the lawyers have to apply some other law, or the judge has to apply some other law in order to take your side in the case. And so Sandra Salve, who's like a brilliant fat legal rights scholar and lawyer, and who started FLAIR, which is the Fat Legal Advocacy Rights and Education Project, which is now run by Brandy Salve. Sandra will always talk about how, judges could be ruling in fat people's favor all the time now, and their own internalized bias or the bias of the system is part of what prevents them from doing that. So you want explicit laws that instruct people in the system that, where are the parameters around what we allow in terms of height and weight discrimination. And in the US right now, Michigan State is the place with the longest, like oldest civil rights law related to height and weight, where, height and weight are just part of the protected classes included in the Elliott-Larsen Act, which is one of their civil rights laws, which was passed in 1977. And then a few years ago, I think it was 2019, that Washington State added protections for people who are classified as medically obese through their state disability laws as part of a Supreme Court decision. So those are the two states that have some protections. And then there are 6 municipalities, 5 cities, and then Washington, D.C., which is, we all think of as a city, but is technically something different than a city. But it's Washington.
Tigress,
Yeah.
sidebar. Let's make sure we come back to after this to talk about why we don't like the O words. Okay.
Okay, sure. So the cities are Washington, D.C., Urbana, Illinois, Madison, Wisconsin, San Francisco, California, Santa Cruz, California, and Binghamton, New York. Those are the cities that currently have laws. And then there are a handful of places globally. So there are some South American places that have some laws. There's one city in Iceland that has some laws. And that's, that's what and Canada has some laws related to air travel. But that's the picture in the whole world, where it's against the law to discriminate. And sometimes those laws are just based again on just civil rights laws, and sometimes they are appearance-based civil rights laws. So it's which is a little bit different than what you need in terms of accessibility, right? Whether people don't like you because they don't like the way fat people look is a little bit different than they don't want to accommodate your larger body. So those are so that's what we have now. And then Tegan can tell you about what we have coming.
Yeah. One before that, one thing that I do want to note is that it is these laws that exist, and then also the ones that will exist soon, are not only about if you are fat, but also include the perception of fatness. And I think that's a really important point, because our society, being what it is, has a very skewed idea of what fat is sometimes, right? You can spend 2 seconds on the internet and a size 4 will be being called fat, right? There are just our idea of what fat is outside of fat community can be very skewed. And so these policies would also protect people who are not technically fat according to fat community definitions, but who are being perceived as fat by the general public. And that can be for models or actors or whatever, where the body size preference is super, super skewed. I think that's just an important inclusion. But what did you say, Tigress, about that I was going to talk about?
That you were going to tell them where there's pending stuff.
Got you. Yes. Well, there is currently pending legislation in New York City, which is going to pass super soon, and we're very excited about it. There's also pending legislation in New York State, Massachusetts, New Jersey, and Vermont. And so the East Coast is really out here representing.
Yeah, because the pending legislation is all legislation that rose organically from constituents reaching out to their representatives and being like, or from representatives seeing something in the world, that same kind of like Bill Fabry story about how he started NAAFA, like somebody saw something and went, wait, that should be part of that. I love the story from Binghamton, where the law passed a few years ago, because that came from queer community doing activism around all the letters of LGBTQIA, and then being like, who else is missing from this list? Hey, the fat people and the short people are missing from this list too, right? And the good thing about, defining body size discrimination broadly is important, because there are ways in which people can be discriminated against for being in any direction of size, right? Like too short, too tall, too fat, too thin, like all of those things can happen. We just know that, first of all, we are advocates for fat people, so that's what we focus on. But although we are, doing a lot of partnership work with Little People of America, but also we know that the systemic injustices happen at a much greater degree in particular areas of body size. And that is fat, and especially people on the larger end of the scale, the sort of spectrum of fatness. And it tends to be short people more than tall people, because even though there are physical things that tall people need accommodations for, the cultural attitudes about height are different than the cultural attitudes about being short. And so, so it's like, but these laws are good for everybody, right? Like eliminating body terrorism is good for people in all sizes. Creating access is good for everyone in the community, because it means more and more people are participating in all of the beautiful things that happen in a community. So these, we are focused on the impact on fat people because we run the National Association for Fat Acceptance. But we're also like really excited to be in community with everyone who will benefit from passing more and more of these laws.
Body liberation, right? Not just fat liberation.
That's right.
Totally.
So I do want to get back to my question about why we don't love the O words, and why, the O words pathologize our bodies. And that's not okay. But I did want to just mention, in case people are listening to this and aren't aware of what it's like for a fat person, one example I can give people is that the brand new Kaiser hospital that was open here, I went there the first couple weeks after it was open, not one single chair for a fat person. In the pharmacy, okay, where everybody's going to go to the pharmacy more than likely, and not one single chair would fit me. And then, going all kinds of other places where, like the Social Security office, no chairs for me. The DMV, well, one DMV did have chairs, but a lot of them don't. So it's something that happens to me all day, every day. I'm considered to be, I call myself, I'm supersized on the range of fatness, but I have been smaller and still have had the same problem. They just don't, hospitals don't accommodate people of size.
Well, and it's especially upsetting when it is a newer building, like you said, because when we have, just like for the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, right? There are historic buildings that are grandfathered into, not having to make accommodations because, they were built 100 years ago or whatever, right? We can understand, fat people have always existed. People could have always been thinking about what fat people need in community spaces. But especially now, when there are so many people vocally, loudly telling folks what we need in terms of accessibility, there's just really no excuse for a modern building to be being built that is not taking into account lots of different kinds of bodies. And everything that makes the space more accessible for fat people benefits other people too. It benefits disabled people, it benefits some elders, it benefits, like there are all these different ways that, that people can be more comfortable and more safe and, and just accommodated and welcomed by thinking about the fact that fat people exist, and then making a chair like that, or making the hallway wider, or making the exam table wider, right? And all of these things are they become more expensive fixes because you don't think of them ahead of time, or you don't take care of them when they are easier fixes. So, we don't hear so for example, Tegan mentioned the New York City bill, which is on track to pass. And in New York City, that bill is housing, employment, and public accommodation, right? The dream is comprehensive civil rights coverage that's just everything, including medical discrimination, because the current bill in New York City will only cover medical discrimination in as much as the public accommodations pieces can be applied to that, or the employment pieces can be applied to that. And so the dream is just like like a federal civil rights protection. But in the meantime, one of the areas of pushback is sometimes like, well, it'll be so expensive to have to make things more accommodating. Well, that is tough on business owners when it's actually true. It's actually not as true as they are worried that it is. So many of the fixes are inexpensive fixes. They are like, a $10 thing, a $30 thing, whatever. But also, as you're making new stuff, there's just no excuse not to just do it right in the first place, right? So that is really disappointing to hear about Kaiser.
I was going to say pretty much the same thing, Tigress, around like, some of the pushback. Well, okay, I'll start off by saying we haven't gotten a lot of pushback around these bills, which has been amazing. But sometimes when people are engaging not in good faith, it'll be like, okay, oh, you're gonna pass this bill and now I have to only rent my apartments to fat people, like, thinking it's this, we're asking for like the moon and the stars by passing this legislation, right? And literally it would mean like in your pharmacy, for example, there's like a couple chairs that would fit fat people, or like when you are ordering your like uniforms at work, that you make sure there's the option for someone to order up to a size like 6 or 7X. Like it's or a really simple example that we talk about a lot is like in bathrooms that you can put a brick under a toilet. Like it's not these like $8 million changes that these businesses are going to have to make. We are not asking anybody to, completely tear down their business and start fresh. It's literally simple things that make people feel included, feel like they belong, feel like they're safe and wanted in that space. And I mean, if you ask me, the $3 that brick costs is worth it if it makes those people feel safe and comfortable and like they belong in that space.
Also, it's not that much to ask that your hospital has a blood pressure cuff that fits me, because my body style is in the majority of the humans on the planet. So why aren't all hospital rooms, why don't they all have a cuff for both size bodies? I mean, that's got to be like a $3 fix, like you said, Tegan. I can't, it's like the most basic thing if someone can take my blood pressure properly.
Well, and sometimes when it is systemically expensive, it's because it's being underutilized, and it's considered a niche product, right? A blood pressure cuff that fits large size arms shouldn't be a niche product, because we know a great percentage of the population needs larger size blood cuffs. So that should be standard, right? It should just be part of what you're doing. And it shouldn't require a federal law to make you do it, right? What we really love about the idea of passing more legislation is not just the legislation itself, right? Like Tegan always really smartly reminds us that like legislation is not liberation. And we know there's civil rights legislation in all kinds of areas where people still face extreme bias in the culture. But we also know that the passing of legislation creates different cultural dialogues. And it makes people think about things that they haven't thought of before. And sometimes it makes people do things preventatively so that they won't be, penalized by the legislation in some way. So if you're Kaiser, maybe it makes you think, let's just get these chairs so we don't end up in a lawsuit later. Let's just get these blood pressure cuffs so we don't end up in a lawsuit later. Oh, that law doesn't exist yet in New Hampshire where I live, but it's passing in Vermont and New Jersey, so it's coming for us. We better just get it together before it passes, right? And so, that's really important. And the question, Crystal, going back to your question about the O words, obesity and overweight. We don't use the term fat liberationists, avoid that terminology for a couple of reasons. First of all, overweight indicates that there is a particular universal weight that a person can be over or under, that as there's a thing that we all should be, and that it's possible to be over and under that. And we just reject that idea as fat liberationists, that there's a universal, perfect weight. And most of the tools that we've used historically to establish a universal perfect weight, come from something that's not universal at all, right? Like come from a European mathematician deciding that all the men of his own culture are the ideal human, right? And then everything else is derivative of that work. So everything we use for and that's the story of BMI, if y'all don't know, and the story of, like early American insurance charts is all based on that research from BMI, the frameworks that are created by BMI. And even if BMI were perfect at determining something, the classifications of where a person becomes overweight or obese or morbidly obese are arbitrary and can change at any time when the institutions that create those charts decide that for some reason. Say we don't think Americans like rounding, so we'll make this 24 instead of 23.5. Or or we think there's a health we think there's a health thing happening here, or pharmaceutical companies tell us there's a health thing happening here. So we're going to change this cutoff, and overnight millions more Americans are going to get classified as, obese or overweight or whatever. All of that stuff is so subjective, and it is so predicated on weight bias in the creation of it that we just reject all of it, right? Like fat is part of human diversity. Health cannot be quantified by these charts in the way that people try to quantify it. And we don't look enough at whether fat people's health is based on our fat or based on the medical weight bias that we experience when we encounter the health system. So there are all of these really good reasons to just sort of like reject these concepts. And obesity in particular is interesting because, a lot of where we start to really solidify that the idea that obesity is a disease is when the American Medical Association, the AMA, designates obesity as a disease. And they did that against the advice of their own council who studied whether or not it should be designated as a disease.
I wish everybody knew that part of that point. Like it's against their best direction from their own people.
From their own people. And the question is, why might they have done that, right? Like, why might they have done that? And what does it mean to have done it? And who does it impact most deeply? When obesity as a disease is weaponized against fat people, when that concept is weaponized against fat people, it has even more impact on the people who were already most affected by how these charts were not made with us in mind. So it takes this white-centered model and this male-centric model and makes everybody else suffer in comparison to those people. And then when you add attitudes about body fat that are very deeply connected to attitudes about sort of like the perfect human and the savage other that we are trying to juxtapose against, right? Like these really like super racist ideas about why fat is considered so reprehensible. All of this stuff is like all mixed up in the way that we talk about fat today, and the way we talk about health today, and the way we talk about whose bodies deserve to be protected today. And so, when we think about where this stuff shows up. We've talked so far about like where it shows up in employment, where it shows up in public education, where it shows up in the medical system, but it also shows up in things like when there's an incident of police brutality and the person's body size gets blamed for their death. And their body size contributes to like these, police narratives about who is scary or not. And we know that that affects Black people, especially in the United States. And we know it affects Indigenous people and other people of color in the United States. And so, but what happens when you show up as a defendant in a courtroom? What happens when you show up as a trans person looking for gender affirmation surgery? What happens when you show up as a fat person, looking for an abortion or looking for fertility treatment? And something like BMI is used to decide what you get.
If you want to adopt a baby, we talked about this before.
Yeah.
It's gonna be used against you.
If you want to keep your own babies.
Yeah, I was just gonna say.
You separate from your partner and they use your weight against you in terms of whether you're a good parent or not, or they use your child's weight against you. So there are like all these ways that this stuff shows up. And part of what upholds it is that medicalized idea about obesity. That it's okay to treat fat people really poorly because we don't care enough about our bodies to take care of ourselves anyway. So why should anybody else care about our bodies?
Right. Yeah.
Right?
This would be a good time to mention Sabrina String's book.
Yes.
Fearing the Black Body. Amazing read.
Sabrina, Dr. String's work is really important. And also, Deshaun Harrison's work is really important in terms of looking at how anti-fatness is anti-Blackness. Jessica Wilson is doing really important work about like reclaiming narratives about Black folks, Black women and femmes and our bodies. Like I notice in fat community that sometimes people seem to forget that there are really brilliant Black people other than Deshaun and Sabrina. And so I want to make sure that that folks know like some of their Whitney Trotter in the world of like Hayes World and Dr. Suzanne Johnson or nurse practitioner Suzanne Johnson. Like there are all these like really brilliant people. And there's a narrative around fighting weight stigma that looks like the reason we should fight weight stigma is because then we can be nicer to fat people in the medical office and then they'll come get treatment for their terrible, terrible obesity. Right? That is not the framework of fat liberation. The framework of fat liberation is we should stop having weight bias against fat people, period. Period. And also that the whole anti-obesity medical industrial complex creates stigma. It doesn't solve stigma. You don't solve a social justice problem by changing people's bodies. You solve a social justice problem by changing the systems that create the social justice problem. And so, again, like when we talk about obesity, and especially when we treat the idea that there's a national epidemic of obesity as like a real thing, not as a moral panic, when we treat that as like, a real public health crisis versus a moral panic that is motivated by capitalist interests, then we're doing a disservice to fat people and we're actually doing a disservice to all people. So that's why we avoid that terminology. And and a lot of fat liberationists will even go so far as to just not even say the words, to just always only say the O words.
O word, yeah.
Asterisk out letters in the word to indicate that it's being used as a slur against us.
Yep.
And I think there are a lot of really well-meaning people, including people who, before we show up and be like, hey, we don't use that terminology around, be like, we don't do that here, right? We show up and we don't do that here. But before we show up and say that, I think there are a lot of well-meaning people in politics who are using, still using that language. And we know that there's a lot of federal and state level and local policy that is about treating obesity instead of looking at the social determinants of health that impact fat people. And so like when we're thinking about like legislation and civil rights, we don't want to just be thinking about what we want to pass. We want to think about what we want to stop passing. We want to stop passing anti-bullying programs that don't include fatness as a category in which kids are bullied. It's actually the highest category in which kids are bullied. We want to stop passing nutrition programs that require like obesity screenings, right? We want to stop passing things for, for pregnant people and for families that, that when we talk about what their kids need, we talk about their kids' body size instead of their kids' nutritional deficiencies or whatever, right? And so we want to just get obesity concepts out of the government. But that is a much bigger battle even than the battle of trying to pass these civil rights laws.
One of my favorite questions when people say something about overweight, I go, over which weight? Which weight are we talking about? Which weight am I over?
That's how I learned that for the first time. That's how I learned to think about that way.
Which weight are you talking about? Which weight? Where should I be?
Especially because if you're talking about the average weight, like you and I probably have a very different idea. I mean, not you and I, you and whoever you're speaking
the royal
to.
you.
Probably, yes, probably have a different idea of what the average weight is. So, yeah.
And people are normally and naturally really bad at guessing people's weight because people don't have a clue how much people weigh, but that's a whole different story.
I'm one of those people, so I'm very empathetic to it.
Yeah.
We have these like really like greatly exaggerated things from people who are just like, oh my God, that person weighed fill in the blank. And I'm like, do you know that I weigh 100 more pounds than that? Can you just not with the weight? Like, and what if I did? And what if I weighed 300 more pounds than that? Like, all of these attachments to the numbers are really just part of our sort of cultural obsession with this stuff. And also are really just like, I tell people all the time, in many settings, I just refuse to talk about health at all. I work for a civil rights advocacy organization. I don't work for a health organization. So I care about fat people's health in that I want fat people to stop being systemically oppressed by the healthcare system. Right. And I want individual fat people to live their best lives. And I want us all to have body autonomy where we're making the choices we think are right for our own bodies. But I really believe in informed consent about the choices we're making about our bodies. And we can't have informed consent if the information we are receiving is biased. So much medical research doesn't include fat people in the research. I saw an ad on Instagram that was asking people to send in poop samples. You're going to test poop samples, right? You could be a part of this study, be part of this important medical research. We're going to test your poop. And it had a BMI cutoff. Now,
Lord.
Why do you need to know my BMI to get my poop in the mail? I wasn't going to send my poop in the mail in the first place. But if somebody wanted to do this study as a way to participate in medical research, to make sure that we are included in medical research, why on earth would my BMI have something to do with that?
I don't know. I feel like the postal delivery people are not paid well enough anyway, because that's how Kaiser does their tests for colonoscopies and stuff, is poop test. But yeah, what I want, Tigress, is I want, if a fat person needs a new knee or a new shoulder or a new hip, I just want them to be able to fucking get their surgery.
Yeah.
Drives me nuts, because we all know the second you tell a hospital that you're willing to have weight loss surgery, they can figure it out. But you want a new knee, oh, you're going to have to go on a diet or whatever their bullshit line is.
Well, it's a risk-benefit analysis, right? Go ahead, Tegan.
Well, okay, so what I was going to say is this is actually really interesting because, like I mentioned, I work for a basic income program for my day job, right? So I work with a lot of people who are experiencing poverty, and they're all identify as women, right? And it's really interesting the way that my day job and my NAAFA job intersect so often, because part of my job is just getting to know these women through research, through whatever, and the amount of women who have had gastric bypass surgery is so shocking to me. And I did a lot of research into this, and it's completely covered by Medicaid, right? And it's just so fascinating because you're talking about, oh, I want them to get the knee, I want them to get the shoulder, but the number of women that I also have to support appealing decisions from from whoever decides Medicaid or their insurance company or whatever, because they can't get medication for whatever chronic illness they have or whatever, they antidepressant or whatever medication they need, right? And they have to pay so much money to get this, or Medicaid doesn't cover it, or it's this whole cycle. But then the second that they say that they want their stomach mutilated, or, you know, are forced into this situation, and a lot of them, Medicaid's like, oh, yep, covered. Yep, when can we schedule you? Like, it's just so remarkable. And
Right,
yet
but if you, sorry.
no, you're good. But like, yeah, if they wanted medication for like their chronic illness, which arguably would make their life a lot easier, it's like this months long process to even just get approved for that.
But this is one of the reasons why we reject the classification of obesity as a chronic illness, because that is exactly how that happens, right? We can treat this chronic illness through weight loss surgery, and that's simpler and more complicated. I mean, you know, simpler and less complicated to us, because we don't care what happens to this person after the surgery, right? And so like there are all kinds of, I mean, the conversation, weight loss surgery could be its own whole episode, and I know that's not, like, I know y'all on the Big Sexy Chat are not always quite as heavy as the topics that we're getting into today, but like all of these pieces could be their own whole episodes. And there are, you know, other podcasts and really great books and, you know, Substacks that you can read and newsletters that you can get on where you can learn about all this kind of stuff. If you're brand new to this and you're already like, this is so much, like Murph was saying earlier, like I'm just processing, right? It's so much. You know, Tegan and I have been doing this work for years, and there's still stuff that we're like, wow, that's a whole nother layer to add on to it, right? It's all very, very complicated. So here's the simple thing. Fat people deserve to be treated with equity in the culture. And passing laws can help do that, and can help change the conversation around it, and can help shift the social mindset around it. So there's this thing that happens where, you know, the mindset starts to change just enough to get the public behind passing the laws. And then the laws pass and more people start to think about it, or systemic change starts to happen because people, you know, are trying to prevent lawsuits or whatever. But that creates even more normalcy about accessibility. Like, I don't like using the word normal around bodies, right? Because there's what's typical, but that's not necessarily what's normal, right? But I do like using the word normal around accessibility practices. It should be a normal thing to be able to be accommodated. And that if you are in a place that's not already accommodating, the people approach you with accommodating and an accommodating attitude, right? It's so, you know, back to that question of like, is it hard for small businesses sometimes to make these changes? Sure. When we're talking about Kaiser, you can replace all the toilets, you can put in bigger toilet stalls, you can replace all the chairs, you can put in all the exam table. Like, Kaiser has money, right? When it's your mom and pop shop down the street, right, that might be a different thing. But also, if they approach you with an attitude of accommodation, that's a totally different thing than if they approach you like you are the problem. How dare you wish to be accommodated? Because you are not the problem. Your body is not the problem. This, you know, this constant narrative that if you're facing lack of access, the solution to that is changing your body by losing weight. When we don't even have proven ways to do that and make it stick, is just absurd. And so if you don't walk out away from, you know, listening to this podcast with anything else, you know, walk away with that. Like, you are not the problem. You know, the world needs to be more accommodating, and we need to all be trying to make everybody fit and, you know, like, be welcomed. And you can support legislation to do that. You can support you know, communicating with businesses and organizations in your areas when you see areas that they're not accommodating, even if they're accommodating to you, right? Don't make the fat people be the only one to say, hey, I can't have a meeting here because this bathroom is too small. You are having the meeting there. You know, you tell the building, don't wait until the fat person comes and has to pee on themselves, right? So like, there's stuff we can all be doing to help pass the legislation, but there's also stuff we can all be doing outside of the legislation.
Awesome. Then, okay, so what I wanted to ask is, this has been super inspiring for me, and I know for a lot of our listeners, and just hearing the work that you're both doing is incredible. And I hope that it's inspiration for other states and other cities to make these sort of movements, excuse me, and include NAAFA. So this has been inspirational, but what inspires you both?
That's a really good question. And a really hard one to answer. um, okay, well, Tigress, do you want to go first? Do you have your answer?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
Y'all gonna think I'm just being cheesy, but Tegan actually really inspires me. And Tegan as an individual inspires me, but also Tegan as a representative of like her generation really inspires me, because seeing cross-generational activism in this movement is really important. And it really, like, I am moved by the efforts of our fat community elders, all the things that they did to lay the groundwork that I inherited as an activist. And then I am also I think it's really important for us to be led by folks across generations, not just in a sort of like chronologically top down way. And so getting the opportunity to learn from and work with and like have as colleagues folks across generations, but for me especially, the Gen Z activists are pushing some like they're just pushing some really important work. And I'm really happy that they let me come along for the ride and treat me with respect when I come along. um so yeah, I mean, I am really lucky to work with colleagues at NAAFA. NAAFA is, predominantly volunteers. And we are working on increasing our resources so that we can have more paid staff and people being people being compensated for their labor. But for most of the organization's history, it's been volunteers. And now almost everybody in leadership is in leadership as a volunteer. And those of us who are getting limited compensation, that's only been happening for a very short amount of time. So, I'm inspired by folks who are willing to dedicate their lives to this. I feel lucky to have Tegan as our advocacy director.
Oh my goodness, that's so sweet. um so my answer is kind of similar actually. I was going to say I keep a really wonderful community around me, and that definitely includes Tigress. Just of people who are so brilliant in so many different ways, not just, contemporary or traditional ideas of brilliance. And I keep people around me who have been through really difficult and really horrible circumstances and who have come through the other side and continue to laugh and smile and be funny. And I mean, Tigress mentioned earlier, like this podcast isn't normally this like heavy or not depressing, because I mean, I hope we're trying to have like a more positive spin on things, right? But like it is upsetting to like hear about discrimination and all the ways that the system is working against us, right? But to see people continue to laugh and experience joy through all of that, I mean, Tigress and I, like, we will be working on this stuff, but literally the first 30 minutes of all of our meetings are just like gossiping or like talking about stuff we saw on Instagram. Like laughter and just joy and fun, I think, is such an important part of the work. And so keeping people around me who never let me forget that, never let me stop laughing or stop smiling or stop having fun, has been really inspiring and motivating for me.
When I think about what I know of NAAFA's history, there's all kinds of stuff that, like, NAAFA messed it up sometimes. We need to be accountable for that as an organization. And, and those pieces are really important. But when you talk to people for whom NAAFA was a big part of their lives, what you hear about is the people they met, the friendships they formed, what it meant to be in community with other people who were not judging them because of their bodies, what it meant to be able to see another fat person in a swimsuit at the pool party, what it meant to see fat people on the dance floor at the dance, and the fat, supersized people on the runway at the fashion shows. Like, the fun pieces are just as important as the hard work of fat liberation. And I love it that so many of our fat liberation organizations, because NAAFA is not the only fat lib organization, so many of our fat lib organizations are taking time and making time to engage in acts like collective acts of fat joy, and making sure that we have time to just like rest and be together in the face of all of these really, really difficult, civil rights challenges that we have to encounter in the world. And I think that part of community is like so important. So like that's part of what, that's part of what you all do with your listeners, is create community that way.
Yeah.
I saw that you all are nominated for an award for your podcast. And that's why, right? Because you like, you inspire people. You inspire people to learn more about all of these things. And to learn more about their favorite vibrators. But like, you inspire people, and that's part of fat joy, right? Like, fat sexuality is an important piece of
Mm-hmm.
so like all of that stuff is it's not, the fun stuff is the work too. Right? It is like anything you do as a fat person is middle fingers up to a culture that wants you to not be as a fat person.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's just, if you watching fat people, do choreography on TikTok, that is something that counts for something.
Absolutely.
Version of something.
Unapologetically fat. My favorite. My favorite.
Yes.
I also am very inspired. I don't know how old Tegan is, but I am very inspired by the younger generation. I cannot wait until they're all in control. I feel like it's going to be like the world I want to live in, that's going to be open-hearted and open-minded and accepting of everybody. That's my dream. And I feel like it's starting to be, it's percolating. I know we're all working at it, but that generation just seems like it's going to be like, pow, I can't wait.
Absolutely.
I hope so. But I will say that we are only as amazing and great as we are because of the people that came before us and like taught us how to be, right? Like, we weren't just born knowing empathy and knowing how to have an open heart and an open mind or whatever. Like, it's the people who had to fight their way through a culture that wasn't as open-minded and open-hearted and all these things that like taught us how to be. And so I just hope people my age always remember that like we stand on the shoulders of the people that came before us. It's owe them all that we have.
Very well put. I wanted to just ask real quick. We need to talk about what people can do, how we have to get them to sign the petition. But just real quickly, are there any laws or rules or legislation around at the federal level?
No, we don't anticipate that there will be a successful federal law until we've established more at the state and municipal level.
Makes sense.
Given the federal climate, and in particular the sort of like anti-woke politics at the federal level, and the way that this could be categorized, like, a civil rights law around body size could be categorized as just like, body positivity ran away with the woke crowd or whatever. It's just, we don't think that it would be viable at this time. And we know from the example of what happened with marriage rights, we know from what is happening now with the Crown Act, which for folks who don't know is the act that helps prevent hair texture discrimination for Black folks around our natural hair textures. We know that trying to get it through the federal government right now would take resources we don't have as a movement and would be likely to be unsuccessful until we have a better track record elsewhere. So what we're doing at NAAFA is, we're finalizing some landscape investigation about places where we might want to try to initiate laws at the state or municipal level. There are, as I said earlier, the places where there are laws that are pending, those rose organically. They didn't come from like NAAFA went to the government and said, you should do a thing. The Massachusetts law has a lot of history of involvement with NAAFA and with the folks from Flair. The Massachusetts, they've been trying to pass a law there for, like years. But the team that is carrying the law there now, Representative Nguyen and Senator Roush, are, I think, gonna make it happen this year. The New York City law, like Tegan said, is we are fully expecting that one to pass. All signs are pointing in that direction, and we think that will also cause some ripple effects across the country.
Right on.
So, we want to be as strategic as possible about this and making sure that people in different parts of the country are working together on supporting laws, so that when they do pop up without NAAFA, we get involved, not to try to like take that away from the person who started it, but to try to support the person who started it, and to try to have like the legal experts like the Salves, and folks like that, looking at the language of the law to make sure it's as comprehensive as possible. So if you're listening to this and you're thinking like, why not my hometown? We do encourage you to reach out to us or reach out to Flair, and let us know what you're thinking. We're not quite ready with our research to start talking publicly about which places we're looking at. We're still doing a little bit more strategic thinking around that. But if you sign the petition for size freedom at our website, then when we start working in your area, we will let you know that. And if you let us know in the info field on that petition that you want to be involved directly when we're working in your area, that you have stories to tell for government committee hearings, or that you have connections to folks that you want us to know about, you can share all of that by signing the petition. And the Size Freedom campaign is something we started with Flair and with support from Dove. And this is like Dove's, I know folks in fat community can have some mixed feelings about Dove and body positivity and whether they were part of co-opting that and whatever. And I think those are all valid criticisms, and believe me, Dove has heard them from me. But also, the way that Dove is showing up now, we really believe in as an organization. We really believe that Dove is, committed to helping support this legislation. They are letting NAAFA and Flair take, the driver's seat, and they are showing up as support partners. And they've put together a fantastic team of allies to help, spread the word. And all of those resources, we hope that Dove's work will inspire more people with major resources to support this movement. Fat liberation is one of the most underfunded, and low capacity movements in the world. And we want more folks with resources to show up in favor of this and in support of this. So we hope that will, that folks will follow Dove's example that way. And that they will also follow Dove's example in like letting the fat people lead it, not letting the corporate people lead it, like letting advocates and activists lead it. And so that campaign, the Size Freedom campaign petition is on our website, and you can learn more about the campaign at naafa.org/sizefreedom. And it is really the best starting point for letting us know that, you want to put your, you want to raise your hand as somebody who wants to be involved.
Sure.
Or if you also don't have a lot of capacity and all you want to do is sign the petition so that you have, added your name to the list. Petitions don't always directly make change, but they can help gather media attention. They can help gather the attention of politicians. And so, it's okay if that's the only step you have in you right now. You can take that step. And then of course, if you are a person with resources, you can give money to NAAFA, you can give money to Flair, you can give money to organizations, like this. No Lose is also a 501c3, which is a fat rights organization that is queer centered. Fat Rose is not a 501c3, but it's doing like amazing work. And if you don't care about getting a tax coupon or whatever, like Sacred Spaces for Fat Bodies, ASDA, the Association for Size Diversity and Health, like there are all these like really, really wonderful individual influencers and organizations who are doing incredible things. And if you have some extra jingle jangle in your pocket, throw some coins at them,
Thank
right?
you. Yeah.
And, throw some dollars and throw some cashier's checks if you've got it like that, because that resource piece too is something we don't talk about often enough.
Yeah.
Because we don't like to talk about money, but we need a lot of money to make legislative change happen.
Yeah, I'm looking at you, Lane Bryant, Torrid, Big Fig, all those brands that.
Well, yes, and also I'm not just looking at you, Lane Bryant. I'm looking at you, Macy's.
Macy's,
right?
yes.
I'm not just looking at you, Big Fig. I'm looking at you, Serta, right?
Yeah,
Like,
no,
it
true.
doesn't have to be only the fat serving
Right.
corporate people that show up with their money.
Yep.
They don't have as much money as, we ain't taking no money from Walmart, but like we're not taking money. NAAFA is not. The rest of y'all should take Walmart's money if you want to. But like, we're like all of these, the idea that fat folks are the ones who should support fat folks is, thank you, fat folks, for showing up with your support. And also, everybody else should show up with support for this movement because it benefits everybody. It doesn't only benefit fat people.
100%.
Everybody by making the world a better and safer place for people in all kinds of bodies. When we say all bodies, we mean all bodies.
Uh-huh.
Right? And so we need thin allies who, and I don't know how many thin folks y'all have in your podcast audience. I hope you have a lot. I hope they are voting for your award, and I hope that they are downloading your podcast, and I hope that they are giving money to fat organizations and fat individuals who are leading this really important work.
Really important. And the two of you are very important in all of NAAFA. I appreciate all of your advocacy, all of your education, all of your everything. Thank you. And I thank you both for being on the show with us tonight. We love having you, Tigress and Tegan. Nice to meet you. And
You're not going to ask us about our favorite vibrators, Crystal?
I know you keep saying you're going to come on one of these days to talk about something sexy. But I thought
next
maybe
time
not tonight.
We'll come back and we'll do like the fun NAAFA chat.
Yeah,
this is like the serious NAAFA chat, and then we'll do the fun one.
It's just the size freedom campaign, and the next time we'll do like the sex freedom campaign. Or something.
There you go. Yes, I love it. Thank you so much. I really appreciate both of you being here. I know you're up late for us tonight, Tegan. I appreciate that. And Murph, anything else you want to say?
No, same. Just we truly appreciate it, and it's always wonderful to talk to Tigress and Tegan. It's wonderful to meet you, and just the work that you're doing is incredible and so inspiring. So thank you.
So check us out. We're on BigSexyChat.com is our website, and our podcast is called Big Sexy Chat. And we have about 25 or 30-ish episodes now about all kinds of different, and you'll see Tigress in a few of them, actually. Thank you, Tigress. And yeah, thanks for all of your support. Check us out. Make sure you go to our website, BigSexyChat.com. You can sign up to receive our newsletter. I'll definitely put the petition in our next newsletter that's going to go out. And I'm going to say, see you later, alligator.
After a while, crocodile.
Out the door, dinosaur.
So long, King Kong.